Chapter 10 of Fact Stranger Than Fiction by John Patterson Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In the Senate, Sunshine and Shadow. When the Senate of the 70th General Assembly was organized, I was duly sworn in and took my allotted seat, which was near the center aisle in the outer rim of the semicircle, my nearest neighbors being the senators from Hamilton County. Of course, I was easily the cynosure of all eyes, but that fact was not to be wondered at, for it was an historical event which marked in an unmistakable way the steady onward trend of a great people whose ancestors for the most part had scarcely emerged from a barbaric despotism. True it is that prior to this time 2 different colored men had been elected to the Senate of the United States and had been sworn in as members of the same and served their term, but these men were not elected by popular vote. They were elected by members of legislatures in 2 of the Gulf states during the Reconstruction period, at a time when their respective states were dominated by the votes of the freed men, and some of the legislators could neither read nor write. The relative strength of the respective classes, white and colored, in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County at the time of my election was about as 1 or perhaps 2 to 100, and all the functions, social, political, and educational, were in the hands and under the control of white male citizens, which constituted a marked contrast between elections of colored men in Ohio and those in the lower tier of Southern states. As an indication of the view taken of my election by whites in Ohio, the following anecdote will be enlightening. I was sitting at my desk on the floor of the Senate when a white gentleman visitor approached me, and the following colloquy ensued. Gentleman, I beg pardon, but are you a member of this Senate? The writer, yes, sir, I am a member of this body. Gentleman, with apparent surprise, where are you from? The writer, I'm from the 25th, the Cleveland district. Gentleman, still more surprised, how on earth did you ever get here? I answered him by saying that the people were not only just but generous, and that they had sent me to the Senate, partly out of compliment to the colored residents of the district, and partly as a reward of merit for my long years of fidelity and labor in behalf of the Republican party and at the local bar. Then followed a long conversation between him and me, in which he showed his great surprise at the extraordinary progress made by the colored people since emancipation under discouraging handicaps. The presiding officers of this Senate were the late Andrew L. Harris, President of the Senate, and Elbert L. Lampson, President pro tem, both learned and able men. Mr. Harris subsequently became governor of Ohio, and Mr. Lampson was for years the honored and efficient reading clerk of the House of Representatives at Washington. On an auspicious occasion, President Lampson called me to preside over the Senate of Ohio, and I gladly and eagerly availed myself of the opportunity. For although my active experience as a parliamentarian was exceedingly limited, yet here was opportunity knocking at my door, and I dared not let it pass me by. During the half hour or more which elapsed while I occupied the chair, the Honorable James E. Campbell, ex-governor of Ohio, entered the Senate chamber, and I had the superlative pleasure of introducing him to the senators who stood to receive him. It is also worthy of note, I think, that during the same period of time I was the de facto lieutenant governor of the state of Ohio. Later on I will include a list of all the bills which I actively supported while a member of the Senate, but at present I shall confine myself to mentioning a few to which I gave a special and energetic effort. First, the streetcar vestibule bill, which made it obligatory on the part of the owners and operators of streetcars to annex to them enclosed vestibules for the protection of motormen and conductors from the rigors of winter and inclement weather. Prior to that time, both of those employees were compelled to protect themselves from the weather as best they could without any other than that of their wearing apparel, and since their motor power was horses, the opportunities of warming themselves were few and quite inadequate. The bill came over to the Senate from the House, but the lobby in opposition to it in the upper house was so strong and influential that it found at first little or no favor. Here I found an opportunity of repaying to some extent the many favors which the laboring men had conferred on me, and I lost no time in going to the front in support of this bill. I builded more wisely than I anticipated, and ere long had the satisfaction of seeing the bill enacted into a law, still existing, which resulted in the placing of vestibules on the front and rear of every railway passenger car. It was argued that the glass windows in the front of the proposed vestibules would become frosted and covered with snow, so as to obscure the vision of the motorman, thereby increasing fatalities and other accidents. But down to this date the prophecy has not been fulfilled, nor does it seem likely to be in the future. Another bill which I took under my wing, metaphorically speaking, was the one which provided that the coal miners of the state should be paid by the run of the mine instead of by the screen, which was then in vogue. Now there were annually many thousands of tons of fine coal which passed through the screen and sold at a good price in the market, for the mining of which the miners received no pay, and it seemed only reasonable and fair that they should be recompensed for all that went into the market. The bill was bitterly, stubbornly opposed by the mine owners throughout the state, and the arguments and other efforts to secure its defeat were numerous and at times interesting. I, as in the case of the vestibule bill, espoused the cause of the laborers, but as my memory now serves me, the bill could muster the support of only 6 votes amongst the entire membership of the Senate, and failed a passage. However, it is still a source of great satisfaction to me to know that I strenuously supported our idea, which ultimately prevailed, and that for many years the hard workers down in the coal mines underneath the ground have been receiving their just reward in this respect, whatever else may be said apropos of other contentions. A humorous sequel arising out of this contention over the anti-screen bill will bear repeating here, I think, and I will add, I did not become fully informed in the premises until after the lapse of a decade or more of years, so well had my informant kept the secret. At a time when the contest was at its topmost height, a senator came to me and said, "Senator, the so-and-so coal company has a book of abstracts of coal lands, which they desire to have examined by an expert, and have referred them to you. They will pay you well for your work, and I hope you can accept the offer." I thanked him, and lost no time in coming in touch with the company, and receiving from them a book of about 30 abstracts of title to coal lands in the heart of the coal-producing section. I carried the book to my lodgings, and from 5 o'clock a.m. until the breakfast bell rang, for several days I scrutinized those abstracts until the work was finished, when I returned it to the office in Cleveland, duly certified in accordance with my instructions. The gentleman who received it asked me my charge, when I promptly replied $25. I shall never forget the blank stare which he directed at me, but he said nothing. Going to his desk, he drew a check and handed it to me. I accepted it gratefully and took my departure. As the years passed by, the transaction passed out of my mind, until one fine day a personal friend of mine said, "Senator, I have a joke on you, which I have kept for 10 years, but I guess I can tell it to you now." I, of course, became curious to know the purport of it, and said to him in substance, "Let me see what in thereat is, and this mystery explore." Then he made known to me the fact that the employing of me to examine the abstracts was one way of winning my vote against the run of the mine bill, by giving me an opportunity of collecting from the corporation the sum of $500, more or less. I collected less, hence the blank stare, when I presented my bill for $25. The establishment of a system of parks and boulevards was a subject which at this time was claiming much attention in Cleveland. The munificent gift of Mr. J. H. Wade, Mr. J. W. Gordon, and Mr. Jacob B. Perkins had made this possible, but all 3 of the gifts being predicated to some extent on the future development and upkeep of the system, it became necessary to finance the undertaking in order to preserve them and initiate the much-needed improvements. To that end a bill was drawn, having as its object the bestowal upon the city of Cleveland, through the designated authorities, power to issue and sell bonds in the sum of $1 million for the purpose of carrying out the conditions of the several grants, and to render them to some extent adaptable to the needs of the people. This bill was placed in the hands of Senator Wilbur Parker, but after it came from the committee on his motion, it was referred to a select committee of one, himself, and for some reason which I have never known, he carried it in his pocket for several weeks, and notwithstanding the importunities of the Cleveland friends of the bill, he failed to report it back to the Senate. Finally, one day when he appeared on the floor of the Senate after a long absence, I moved that the select committee of one to whom was referred Senate Bill number so and so be discharged from further consideration of the same, and the motion carrying, the bill came once more before the Senate for consideration. Thereupon, at the instigation of Senator Parker, a motion was made for the reconsideration of the motion just adopted, and a battle royal ensued between the friends and foes of the bill, led by this writer, which threatened at times to eventuate in the loss of the bill, for the adjournment of the Senate was near at hand, and the present opportunity was golden. The motion to reconsider was lost, and the law was enacted, which placed on a firm foundation our present elaborate, extensive, and beautiful system of parks and boulevards, which is a source of so much pleasure and healthfulness to all classes of our people. About this time, a bill which had passed the House, of which the late Senator William T. Clark was the author, came over to the Senate and was put on its passage. It was a bill which provided that the firemen of Cleveland should be allowed a few hours off duty every week, since at that time they had no time off at all for any purpose whatever. In consonance with the policy which during my entire legislative career had characterized my conduct, I supported the bill, in fact took charge of it, and had the satisfaction of seeing it become a law. When the passage of this bill became known in Cleveland, there was an immediate outburst of anger on the part of some interested persons. An indignation meeting was called and held, and Mr. Clark and I were soundly berated, for it was said that the granting of a few hours of recreation to each fireman would require an addition to the number of firemen, and thereby entail an extra expense which the taxpayers would have to pay. I came from Columbus and confronted that boiling, bubbling meeting, and demanded to be heard. After much pounding of the stand with his gavel, the chairman secured a hearing for me, and before I took my seat my utterances were loudly applauded. But the general trend seemed to be averse to allowing the firemen any time off, and within a few days the Honorable Joseph C. Block, now ex-Judge Block, introduced a bill to repeal the obnoxious legislation, and it was eliminated from the statutes of that General Assembly. The sequel to all this tempest in a teapot is that within a year or two there was a law enacted granting to the firemen more time off than the Clark bill provided for, and today they have still more time allowed them. Truth, justice, crushed to earth, will rise again. I recall my connection with that ill-fated bill as one of the proudest transactions of my life, and I enjoy telling about it. It is generally known that we have on the pages of our statute books a law known as the Civil Rights Law, which was fathered by the Honorable Harry C. Smith, who for 3 terms represented the county of Cuyahoga, Cleveland, in the House of the General Assembly. This law is far-reaching in its scope and includes, amongst other public services, barber shops, though it is, as regards them, a dead letter, since there are few men who have the nerve to compel by law an unwilling, hostile barber to shave them. During the 70th General Assembly, the Honorable George H. Jackson of Cincinnati, who was the colored member of the House from Hamilton County, introduced a bill to repeal that portion of the law relating to barber shops, and supported it on the floor of the House with much eloquence and force, so that it passed without a dissenting vote, as I now recall the transaction. The question now was how to pass it in the Senate. Mr. Green's opposition to it, non obstante, for it was well known that I was fundamentally opposed to turning revolutions backwards. On the contrary, it was easily apparent to all the friends of the colored race in the State that what the law stood most in need of was not the elimination of any of its provisions, but more thorough enforcement. It was thought that if Mr. Jackson could make his great speech before the Senate, the bill would pass that body, no matter whether this writer opposed it or not. So a little strategy was adopted in order to enable Mr. Jackson to address the Senate, and since by the rules of the Senate he could not be permitted to address that body, as such it was resolved into a committee of the whole Senate, and the author of the bill was permitted to make his argument for it before that body, sitting as a committee. This trick seemed to be a success until after the committee rose and went back into its legitimate form of a Senate, when this writer arose at his desk and characterized the whole procedure in anything but a complimentary way, and with clenched fist, which hammered the desk before him, dared the senators to eliminate any portion of that law, and he threatened, if the bill passed the Senate, to go to the colored voters of the State and denounce their action. On the roll call, the bill failed to receive the required number of voters to pass it, and from that day until the present no other effort by white or colored has been made to repeal or emasculate the law. About the year 1892, the Cleveland Railway Company, which was composed of all the street railway companies in the city of Cleveland, save and except the interest represented by Mr. Tom L. Johnson, began to consider seriously the necessity of disposing of its horses and adopting electricity as a motor power, and this made necessary an entire change in the way of trackage, rolling stock, power plants, and employees, to say nothing of the vast outlay necessitated in the erecting of poles, stringing of costly wires, and the acquiring in some instances of additional rights of way and sites for the location of enlarged and costly buildings. The late Senator M. A. Hanna, upon whose broad shoulders rested principally the responsibility and burden of financing these very costly projects, decided that it would be necessary to sell the paper of the company in New York in order to compass success in this behalf, and that they might get a fair consideration for the same. It was equally essential to make a showing of a franchise adequate for the proffered security. For the foregoing reasons, and as a first move towards the accomplishment of these designs, a bill was prepared commonly known as the 99-year franchise bill, and given to the late Senator Frank O. Spencer, who introduced it in the Senate, and it was thereafter known of record as Senate Bill No. 50. The bill provided in substance that the trustees, councilmen, of any city or township should be empowered to grant to any railway corporation within its limits a franchise not to exceed 99 years in duration, provided the trustees or directors of the company should agree to pay to the city or township a percentage of the gross earnings of the road, to be fixed by and between the respective parties at the time of the granting of the franchise. At that time, the only financial benefit Cleveland was receiving from the said companies was a tax of $10 on each car in use, while a percentage of their earnings by the provisions of the Spencer Bill would even then have amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And at the present day the city's income from that source would be perhaps $1 million or more annually, provided, however, that the trustees of the city were honest and businesslike, and withheld the franchise until an adequate percentage of their earnings was secured by the terms of the contract. This bill was favored by some of the leading financiers and politicians of Ohio, and it had behind it in the lobby the influence and professional services of one of the greatest law firms in the state. Moreover, the governor of the state, in the person of the late President McKinley, favored it and permitted the use of his office in which to caucus with reference to it. Dan Ryan, Secretary of State, favored it and lent his great influence to secure its passage. The Toledo Blade, Ohio State Journal, and Cleveland World, all influential newspapers, spoke of it in commending terms, and the entire sentiment in and about the State House, in so far as I could discover, favored its passage. This narrator, too, was of opinion that a contract between the city of Cleveland and the street railway lines could be framed, by the terms of which the city would derive a substantial income, whereas under the then existing conditions and down to the present time little or nothing was going into our treasury. Under the circumstances, I determined to obtain the opinion of the great daily papers of Cleveland, and with that object in view, I mailed to the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Cleveland Leader, the Cleveland Press, and the Cleveland World, respectively, a copy of the bill, and enclosed with it a written request, signed by me, that they publish the same and comment on its merits or demerits editorially. The World was the only one of the quartet which complied with my request in any manner, and its editorial comment was favorable. However, the fact remains that prior to its passage in the Senate it had never been published in any paper that had come under my notice, and the people of Cleveland to this day have never read the bill. The parties interested in the passage of the bill in the Senate insisted that I should explain and champion it on the floor of the Senate, for the reason, they said, that I was more practiced as an attorney and fluent and eloquent than was its author. I objected strenuously, for the reason that the Cleveland newspapers, with one exception, had remained non-committal, but day after day, time and again, I was compelled to listen to arguments by its friends, and have cited to me the fact of its support by the eminent and influential men and papers outside of Cleveland mentioned above. Finally, word came to me ex cathedra, if I may used the expression in a political sense that I had better stand by my friends, and knowing who those friends were, and forecasting the wonderful part some of them were to play in the great world drama of the near future, swearing I would ne'er consented. I explained the bill, spoke in favor of it, and almost unaided, in so far as it was apparent to the casual observer, secured its passage through that body. Then the Cleveland newspapers spoke out, and with no uncertain sound. To read the papers alone, see the names of Senator Spencer and myself at the head of the editorial column of the Cleveland Leader in mourning, and have no other information in the premises, one would have thought that some great outrage had been perpetrated on the State. Yet those same papers, only a week before, with a copy of that identical bill in their hands, had remained mute. Later on, however, after an indignation meeting at which I was present and explained the merits of the bill, and drew from the large audience in the council chamber encores of applause, popular sentiment was mollified and modified, and another assembly actually enacted a 50-year franchise law without evoking an indignation meeting or the anathemas of the press. The men who originated and procured the passage of the first bill through the Senate were subsequently highly honored by the State and country, and properly so, for they were of nature's noblemen, and dedicated their whole life to the public welfare, whether negotiating along private or public lines, all of which the community, when adequately informed and free from blind passion, readily saw and appreciated. The following certificate, mailed to me by Hon. Alex C. Kane, after I had ceased to be a member of the Senate, gives a detailed statement of work done by me in the Senate, in addition to what I have already mentioned in the foregoing. I hereby certify that Hon. John P. Green supported all the following named bills in behalf of labor while a member of the Senate of the 70th General Assembly. A. C. Kane, Clerk of the Senate. 1. Compelling railroad companies to equip cars with air brakes and automatic couplers. 2. Protecting lives of mechanics employed in the building trades. 3. Protection of street car employees. 4. Regulating competition of convict with free labor. 5. Arbitration of labor troubles. 6. Providing employees with attorney in action for wages. 7. Preventing discrimination against organized labor. 8. Increasing opportunity of education for working people. 9. Relief of overworked railroad employees. 10. Increase in force of mine inspectors. 11. Additional factory inspectors. 12. Enlarging the power of shop inspectors. 13. Imposing heavier penalties for imitation of union labels. 14. Restricting manufacture of knit and woolen goods in public institutions. 15. Employees not to be intimidated in voting. 16. Providing for the more distinct labeling of convict-made goods. 17. Counter floors for safety of employees in construction of buildings. 18. Providing for pure oils for illuminating purposes in mines. 19. Preventing fraud and imposition of minor employees. 20. Against 7 days' work for 6 days' pay. Mr. Green is also author of the Labor Day Law. One of the most agreeable episodes of my life occurred about this time, in connection with a grand banquet tendered to Governor McKinley by the Protective Tariff League of Canton, Ohio. Quite unexpectedly to me, I received an invitation to this notable function, together with an invitation to respond to the following toast: America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. At the appointed time I appeared in Canton, and was received in a kindly, gracious way by the distinguished committee, which was made up of some of the leading gentlemen of the city. I was escorted to the first hotel, where I registered, and was for a day one of its guests. At the banquet I was seated at the head of the table, on the left of Governor McKinley, while at his right sat James R. Garfield, a son of ex-President James A. Garfield. My response to the toast assigned to me met with a very enthusiastic reception, and at the close of the exercises I was heartily commended by many of those present. It has often occurred to me that the climax of my political honors was reached on that occasion, when I, an ex-waiter, boot-black, janitor, and factotum in general, now a member of the Senate of Ohio, from the most famous district in the state, an invited guest at that very notable function, sat beside the governor of the state, then destined soon to be President of the United States, and responded to that significant toast. O ye humble, struggling, ambitious American youth, both white and black, reflect on these facts, ponder over them, take courage, and persistently press onward and upward. About this time also, when the session of the Senate was nearing its close, I had an experience, the relating of which may prove of interest to the readers of this biographical story. During the banquet, Governor McKinley became aware of the fact that I had an increasing desire to visit parts of Europe, including Great Britain, France, Italy, Spain, and Vienna in Austria. Coming to me, he said, "Senator, I think I can be of some service to you in forwarding your desire to make a tour of Europe." I said, "Indeed, Governor, I'm more pleased than I can express to you to hear you say so." "Yes," he replied, "I'm going to New York in the near future, and while there I shall meet Colonel Elliot F. Shepard, a friend of mine, and I shall tell him of you and your plan. He is the owner of the Mail and Express, which employs correspondents in parts of Europe, and perhaps he will give you employment along that line, which will enable you to pay your expenses while you make your tour." I thanked him profusely, my heart swelling with joy and gratitude, for I had learned to know that whatever McKinley espoused was well nigh certain of success. After the lapse of about 2 weeks, the governor's messenger came to my desk and said, "Senator, the governor wishes your presence at your leisure." I thanked him and stayed not on the order of my going, but went. The governor informed me that he had just returned from New York, where he met Colonel Shepard, to whom he made known my cherished desire, and he said the colonel will wire you to meet him there in a few days. True to the expectation, a day or two, I received a telegram from Colonel Shepard inviting me to meet him at his home, located on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 53rd Street in the great metropolis, New York. When I arrived in the front of the palatial residence of the son-in-law of the late W.K. Vanderbilt, Sr., it was all aglow with light, and liveried coachmen and footmen were in attendance upon the numerous equipages which bordered the curb in the vicinage. Nevertheless, not one whit embarrassed by the fact, I pressed the button of the big front door, and my card having been delivered to the distinguished host, I was immediately ushered into the elaborate library, where, ere long, I met a high-born, instinctive gentleman, Colonel Elliot F. Shepard. "Senator Green," he said, grasping my hand, "Governor McKinley has been telling me about you and your plan to visit Europe. I've considered the matter, and I've concluded to offer you the sum of $50 a letter, and you may mail the Mail and Express one letter every week." I answered that such an arrangement would be entirely satisfactory to me, and thanked him for it. Then I said to him, "Colonel, when shall I begin to write the letters?" "At once," he answered, "if you wish." Seeing that his residence was gradually filling with the elite of social New York, he noticed my apparent surprise and remarked, "Senator, this is the anniversary of my silver wedding, and the invited guests are arriving. I am sorry that I cannot be with you longer." Just then 2 gentlemen entered the library. "Senator," he said, "meet my brother." And turning to the younger one, he said, "Senator Green, this my only son. My son, meet Senator Green of Ohio." Then I took my departure, highly elated by my success, for now I considered that my touring venture was predicated on a sound financial basis, and that I could cast all worry on that score behind me. As an addition to the good words which Governor McKinley had spoken of and for me, I placed in Colonel Shepard's hand a laudatory editorial which I had clipped from the Cleveland Leader, referring to the fact that I had risen from a very humble sphere in life. The colonel did not approve of the reference to my former humble station in life. This surprised me greatly. The following week I mailed to the Mail and Express an article, 1 column in length, on the growth of Cleveland as affected by the protective tariff. It was received and published, and in a few days I received a check for $50. The following week, in return for a second letter which had been published, I received another check for the same amount. Then a day or two later I read in a newspaper that Colonel Shepard had died on an operating table under the influence of an anesthetic while undergoing an examination for a minor trouble. I cannot say whether my surprise exceeded my grief. I could not truthfully say. However, thus from childhood's hour I've seen my fondest hopes decay. For, in very truth, my grief was not so much because of my individual loss, as for the fact that a noble, kind-hearted, generous man had been so suddenly cut off in the flower of his manhood, without any notice or opportunity to take his leave of all whom he held most dear on this earth. Be good, my friend, and let who will be clever. Do noble things, not dream them all day long, and so make life, death, and that vast forever, one grand sweet song. Charles Kingsley, in a farewell. The sequel to this narrative will come in the next chapter. Suffice it to state here, other steps had to be taken, other plans formulated and consummated before the contemplated journey could be taken. But in the language of one of Milton's creations, what though the field be lost? All is not lost. The unconquerable will and courage never to submit or yield. End of chapter 10.